Good evening from the beautiful city of Jerusalem, and I'm Zohar Tal, the host of Newsrael's weekly talk and the host of today's first Newsrael Forum. First and foremost, let me introduce our guests tonight. The president of Newsrael, Brigadier General Gal Hirsch.
Good evening.
Middle East expert and Professor Moti Kedar.
Good evening.
President and CEO of Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, Dr. Martin Sherman.
Good evening.
And U.S. relations expert, former Ambassador Yoram Ettinger.
Hello.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Before getting to the bottom of the issues, I would like to invite President of Newsrael, Brigadier General Gal Hirsch, for a few opening remarks.
Well, good evening, shalom, and welcome to the first Newsrael's Forum. We are located here on the top of Mount Scopus, not that far from the Olive Mount, and looking to the Temple Mount. This is actually the right place to start the first Newsrael's Forum. This is our birth nest. This is our biblical roots. And since we believe in our biblical roots and we start all our journey in defending Israel, in securing Israel, in building it from bottom up to the top, this is exactly the place we want to start with. Jerusalem, the holy capital of Israel, the eternal and unified capital of Israel. And thanks very much for joining us this evening, to my friends in this important forum, to Zohar that hosts the forum, and I'm looking forward for our next forums and for you to join us. We will take you all around Israel, but first of all, the first step will be here in the Temple Mount, in Mount Scopus, next to the Olive Mount, in our birth nest, in the eternal city of Jerusalem, our eternal capital. Thank you very much. Welcome and shalom.
Thank you, General, for your remarks. And now, I would like to start on what I'm sure is on our minds, a happy occasion, the emerging peace treaty or arrangement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. And Professor Kedar, you're an advocate for an Emirate-like solution for Judea and Samaria for many years. And so how do you see the importance of the upcoming agreement with the United Arab Emirates?
Zohar, you have no idea how much power today this idea has, more than the announcement about the peace with the United Arab Emirates. Because here we are, Arab states like Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Sudan are failing states, falling apart into swamps of blood and tears, while Emirates, countries which are based on the traditional framework of the tribe or the clan, as it is in the Middle East, are flourishing countries, modern countries, peaceful countries. And this is actually what I'm standing for from so many years. Instead of establishing a Palestinian state, which will be a disaster like Syria or Iraq, to formulate or to form Emirates based on the clans of the cities, Arab cities in Judea and Samaria. And this way, Israel actually set free most of the population, the Arab population of Judea and Samaria, while keeps the large part of the land, the rural areas. And this is the only solution which is connected to the sociology of the Middle East, which unfortunately Europeans and others, especially beyond the Atlantic, they do not get it. They don't see it. They don't understand it, because the kind of societies in the Middle East is different. We are talking about tribal societies. Therefore, the solution should correspond with the sociology, and this is what, thank goodness, we see today flourishing, the peace with the Emirates, which gives another good push for the idea of the Emirates here as well.
Dr. Sherman, is the agreement a game changer in the Middle East?
Well, I think it's still early to break out the champagne and celebrate. You know, the price that Israel's been called on to pay for is to delay the extension of sovereignty over Judea and Samaria.
Right.
And personally, I believe that extending sovereignty over Judea and Samaria is a greater national interest for Israel than formalizing relations which substantively were carrying on anyway. So while I say that other things being equal, the agreement is a good and positive development, I'm not so sure that the price would have been worth it. I'm not quite sure whether Netanyahu could have, under the political constraints that he was under, if he could actually extend the sovereignty. But other things being equal, I think, you know, if sovereignty is off the table, that's not good. If sovereignty is being delayed, that's another question. You know, but I think there are a number of arguments which militate in favor of sovereignty sooner than later. One is the coming elections. Now, just go back.
You mean the elections in the United States?
In the United States. Now, if this agreement is a prop for the choreography of a bigger drama, i.e. the elections in the United States, which may nudge Trump to victory if this is seen as an international policy success for him, that's important, because Israel will be in two different strategic universes depending on the result of the election. If Trump wins, I think we can have a sigh of relief, and if Biden wins, I think there are dark times ahead. But just finally, to sum up, I'd say why I think that we should extend sovereignty before November rather than wait after November is because what I said before, if Biden may win and then it will be off the table indefinitely. Secondly, before the elections, Trump is dependent on his evangelical constituency, who are very pro sovereignty. After the elections, as a second-term president, he doesn't need them. And the third thing is, if it's in the national interests of the Emirates to make this agreement with Israel, it's not really a peace agreement, it's a normalization agreement. If that's in their national interest, why should Israel pay any price to help the Emirates pursue their own national interests? So, to sum up,
you have mixed feelings about the.
No, I think in general it's a good thing, but I'm not sure that the price that we may be asked to pay may be exorbitant.
I see. And, Ambassador Ettinger, on the note of the U.S.-Israel relations with regards to the agreement, how do you see that going forward?
The agreement with the United Arab Emirates highlights the growing importance of Israel as a force multiplier for the U.S. and for every pro-American Arab regime. The main reason, the chief cause for the United Arab Emirates to conclude this agreement has to do with the threats posed by the Ayatollahs of Iran. It's a threat to the US, and it's a threat to every pro-American Arab regime, and it's a threat to Israel. And in this regard, the United Arab Emirates, as do Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, and certainly Jordan and Egypt, they consider Israel to be the most effective life insurance agent in the Middle East. They don't trust the US that much because only 4 years ago there was an administration in the US which played into the hands of the Ayatollahs and literally stabbed the back of the pro-American Arab regimes on the Gulf. Today, the administration treats the Ayatollahs as they deserve, namely sanctions and hardships. But the Arabs don't know what will happen in January of 2021. But they know one thing: whether it's a left of center or right of center government in Israel, they can rely on Israel. In this regard, it's the Israeli posture of deterrence which is the most important. Israel on the mountain ridges of the Judea and Samaria region reflects posture of deterrence. Israel retreating from the mountains of Judea and Samaria reflects hesitancy and retreat and appeasement, which is a deterioration of its posture of deterrence. And last and not least, the agreement with the UAE was signed irrespective of protest and threats by the Palestinians, reflecting the Palestinian reality in the Middle East. The Palestinian issue, irrespective of Arab rhetoric, has never been a top priority for Arabs. And Arabs regard the Palestinians as role model of treachery and subversion and terrorism and ingratitude, and therefore they disregard the Palestinians and are not enamored with the idea of a Palestinian state.
Well, General Hirsch, I want to hear your inputs with regards to the implications on the IDF, and perhaps you can elaborate. I mean, we all remember that with the peace treaty with Egypt, the Egyptians received jet fighters and tanks. Now they're talking about the F-35 that might be provided to the United Arab Emirates. What do we have to do in order to secure the quality advantage of the IDF?
Well, the quality and the competitive advantage of the Israel Defense Forces is something that cannot be compromised. During the last 4 decades, I've been privileged to serve and command Israeli Defense Forces around all the Israeli borders and beyond, and to fight in all fronts and theaters of war that Israel had to cope with. But the last decade and a bit more, since the Arab Spring, Israel is actually completely surrounded by genies that unfortunately has left the battle. The battle was shattered during the snowball of the Arab Spring, the civil wars and the results of it. And the main problem is that we have an industrial genie producer located in Iran, headed by Tehran, the Ayatollah's regime, that produce genies, terrorism, radical, fundamental, jihadist energy, and they want officially to export it as a part of their policy, to export the radical, fundamental, jihadist energy. This is the way they use Quds Force. This is the way that they use the Revolutionary Guards. This is the way that they use Hezbollah, Islamic jihadists, and support Hamas, terror army that actually surrounds us. Now take a look at what is happening all around Israel. And do not forget that Israel is your front guard. Israel is actually the fortress on the spring, the living spring of terrorism in the Middle East. And this is the front guard of the free world. It is very, very important that the front guard and its armed forces will have always the competitive advantage, will be always be able to deter, as we just heard before, to deter all the forces around us and all the terror armies that are around us. All these radical fundamental energies and cells and organizations and armies, and especially the Iranian regime, need always to remember what the Israel Defense Forces and the Israeli Secret Service is able to do, and I believe they already know how we can perform and act. It is very important to preserve it. Now, since we are surrounded by Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iranian militias in Syria, Hamas and Islamic jihadists in Gaza, and we know that Hezbollah and Iran tried its best to do the same in Sinai Peninsula, it is very, very important to achieve peace like our Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government has achieved right now with the Emirates, the UAE. It is very important because we all know that our unique relations today with the moderate states like Egypt, like Jordan, and like other states that let's hope that will be a part of peace agreements, this is actually the way to create buffer zones between actually the belt that is all around us, the radical, fundamental belt that harm Israel and create real danger, not only to Israel as your front guard there in the free world, but to the rest of the free world. Because when the threat, the terror, the insurgency will bypass Israel, it will infiltrate directly to your neighborhoods in Europe, in United States of America, in Australia, in Canada, in Africa, and I can name the names. You can all remember San Bernardino and Beslan and Bali and Nairobi and Paris and London and Madrid and all these places that today are connected also to terror attacks. This is mainly because Israel has been criticized for many years by hypocrites, and today I believe that people believe and understand what Israel does in securing here and guarding this specific place on the living spring of terrorism here in the Middle East.
Dr. Sherman, your thoughts about keeping the Israeli advantage?
Well, I agree that it's very important for Israel to keep its competitive edge in the military field. Although we know, almost paradoxically, every time an Arab country has made peace with Israel, it's immediately upgraded its military, as you pointed out, with Egypt. I don't really know whether the supply of F-35s to the Emirates or Egyptian submarines or German submarines to Egypt are really going to change the balance of power. And I don't want to say too much about it because it may just be in Israel's security interests that it's the Americans and the Germans who are supplying those systems rather than someone else we've got no control over. But I don't want to go into that. But what I want to say about our competitive advantage, it's not only enough to have a competitive advantage, especially when you're talking about the terror threats that General Hirsch was talking about, but you have to have the freedom of action to be able to use that advantage. And here I think is Israel's greatest failure in its public diplomacy. Israel hasn't been able to present the case and describe the circumstances that it exists in effectively. I think Israel has been very, very derelict in setting up its strategic diplomacy to explain why it needs to use its military to safeguard not only itself, but the West. And I've been advocating for years now that if Israel was to spend 1% of state budget, that would be well over $1 billion. Now, with $1 billion, you can change a lot of minds and win a lot of hearts. And so I think not only is having the advantage, the military advantage, important and imperative, it's being able to use it. Because if you don't have it, I think it was Rabbi Shmuley Boter who once said, Israel's got all this advanced equipment, but what good is it if you can't use it? You can have avionics and air force, etc., but if political constraints don't let them take off and do their jobs. So in many ways, public diplomacy is a strategic arm akin to the Air Force. It has to generate the freedom of movement for you, just like the Air Force is supposed to generate freedom of movement for ground troops. The diplomacy is supposed to generate freedom of movement so that you can use your military to achieve your interests. And I think that is an important point which has been overlooked time and time again.
Ambassador Ettinger, how influential is Israel on the US government in terms of weapons distribution?
Well, the idea of Israel's qualitative military edge, the QME, was actually introduced first by President Lyndon Johnson back in 1968 with the supply of the Phantom combat plane, the F-4. It was then later on reinforced by Congress through legislation in 1992-93 and then in 2008, all in order to advance American interest. American interest is advanced by a strong Israel. A strong Israel in the critical area where we are situated between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, between Europe and Africa and Asia, does spare the US the need to deploy to the area few more aircraft carriers and few more ground divisions, which would have cost the US annually probably 15 or 20 billion dollars, all of which is spared by one Jewish state in the Middle East. But to maintain that advantage, that rare ally, you have to provide that ally Israel with a qualitative military edge, which is a means of deterring war. The idea of deterring war sounds very good for the American constituents. And under the American system, the constituent plays the major role in the political system. And therefore, the most constituents in the US do support US-Israel relations. The elected officials in the House and the Senate depend on the voters, and they reflect the will of the voters. And therefore, there is much support for the idea of allowing Israel to maintain qualitative military edge, again, primarily because it serves America's interest. Obviously, it is also a prerequisite for Israel's own national security. And one last comment, unlike NATO countries, unlike Japan or South Korea, we don't want American soldiers to defend us. We ask for the military systems to do that. And those systems, again, have created the most effective pro-American force multiplier anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm. Professor Kedar, would you like to add anything, perhaps with regards to intelligence or anything else?
I would like to draw the attention of everyone to the situation of the Arab world after this peace. The Arab world actually is roughly divided to two parts. One part is dysfunctional states which are hostile to Israel. Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Algeria, Libya, of course. While peaceful countries vis-a-vis Israel are flourishing. Jordan, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Netanyahu visited Oman as well. Egypt, I wouldn't say it's flourishing, but definitely sustainable.
So what's the cause and what's the result?
So here it is. Countries which have peace with these Arab countries, which maintain good relations with Israel. Look, I can go to Morocco. You can also go to Morocco with Israeli passport. Although we don't have official peace with Morocco, Morocco is open for Israelis to come, to visit, for business, whatever we like. Means Morocco also is a stable country, flourishing country. And here you are. Countries which are hostile to Israel are failing countries, bloodbaths, as we see, unfortunately, while countries which are peaceful vis-a-vis Israel are successful and flourishing.
Well, as we all know, the situation in the Gaza Strip is currently escalating, and Professor Kedar, I'll start with you now.
Another failing place, because it's hostile to Israel.
So,
here you are. This is the proof.
And my question is, first of all, immediately, what should Israel do? And how do you see a long-term solution to the Gaza Strip situation?
Well, the problem, first of all, starts with the fact that so far, Israel has some responsibility for Gaza because of the agreements between Israel and the PLO of the 1993. What Israel should do is recognize Gaza as a state, because it is a state. They have borders, they have a government, they have military force, they have police, they have judicial system, they have military industry, they know how to produce projectiles. So, and from every point of view, Gaza is a state. And Israel should recognize it as a state, independent state, and therefore now we don't have to supply anything to Gaza if they don't live peacefully with us. And here you are. If they have to be peaceful in order to get food, believe me, they will be peaceful.
General Hirsch, first of all, your general comment, and specifically, do you think that another land operation is possible or should be considered with regards to Gaza?
Well, I'll just mention that if we will have to recognize Gaza Strip or Hamastan as a state in Gaza Strip, we will have to allow them having their own port,
Not
their own
at all.
airport,
Not at all.
or other direct accessibility
Not
to
at all.
arms. And if not, well, let's hope that something like this is real. Anyway, I'd like to refer to your question, Zohar. I think that since Gaza Strip today, it's a terror land. It is actually a terror army, financed, equipped, trained by Iran. Look, during Protective Edge operation, I was commanding my troops. And when I saw the Nukhba forces, these are the commandos of Hamas terror army, I understood exactly that actually I'm fighting against Hezbollah type of armed forces in Gaza Strip. They were just like Hezbollah forces, and I fought against Hezbollah 14 years ago in 2006 war as the 91st Division's commander on the ground. Now, since we have Hezbollah in Gaza Strip, and we have Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we have Hezbollah type in Syria, the only way I know to dismantle the terror capabilities of Gaza Strip is by another type of Operation Defensive Shield. I've been privileged and honored to be the chief planner of Defensive Shield operation. Let me remind you, March 2002, after the massive intensive terror attacks in Israel, it was Black March as the casus belli. We suffered during 1 month, after 2 years of terrorism, we suffered in 1 month 1,400 badly injured civilian Israelis and 135 killed Israelis, murdered. The Palestinians just murdered them with suicide bombers. That was the time that the state of Israel has made a decision to strike back. And by striking back, defensive shield operation was unique mainly because we worked in any street, house, cave, tunnel, everywhere, 24/7 in order to clear terrorism. And we learned, and the world learned after defensive shield operation, that terror can be defeated. Terror can be defeated by dismantling the terror organizations, its components, its infrastructure. It means that defensive shield became a type of terminology of continuous systematic dismantling. And this is the only military solution for the terror from Gaza Strip. The only military solution for the terror threat from Gaza Strip. And I really hope, that since there are so many hypocrite states, like Turkey, like others, that looks and think and claim so many claims regarding Gaza Strip, I think that there must be an attempt, an effort to try and recover Gaza Strip by injecting monetary fuel, by injecting money to Gaza Strip, and make sure that this place will be economically recovered. And if that will happen, and if Iran will take his hand out of Gaza Strip, maybe we won't have to go there, with the Israel Defense Forces and dismantle this place from terror components. But if not, look, rockets are actually launched towards Israel from Gaza Strip on weekly basis. From time to time, it happens on daily basis. We have the Iron Dome systems. We have multi-layer systems that protects us. It is Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, and other genius systems made by Israel. But one day, there will be a bug, a mistake, bad luck, and one day we will suffer an attack that will cause us many casualties, just like March 2002 Black March, that actually sent us immediately to defensive shield operation. If the world countries, if the people that think so much about Gaza around us won't come and do their best to calm down the leadership of Gaza, to try and help them financially, and to try to make sure that this place will be balanced and calm, the only way that I find a solution for Gaza will be defensive shield operation number 2. If that won't happen, I think that one day we will suffer such casualties, such terrible event, that we won't have any other choice but to go on war towards Gaza. We are the Israel Defense Forces, and that's our role and mission, to secure the state of Israel from any front, from any theater of war, including Gaza.
Dr. Sherman, the same question, short term and long term?
Well, I don't believe that there'll be any consensual solution to Gaza. I think the problem with Gaza, and perhaps here I'm echoing a little bit of what General Hirsch said, I don't think the problem with Gaza is operational. It's conceptual. I think it's a mistake to relate to the population in Gaza as the victim of their leadership. They are the crucible in which that leadership was formed and from which it emerged. Because if they had a different population, you'd have a different leadership. I think we have to stop relating to Gaza in particular and the Palestinians in general as a prospective peace partner. You have to relate to them as an irreconcilable enemy and treat them as an irreconcilable enemy. I think that Israel has made grave errors. At the beginning of the talk, General Hirsch mentioned terror threats against Israel. They've all been the result of Israel relinquishing territory, whether it was in Lebanon, whether it was in Gaza, whether it was in Sinai. Wherever Israel has relinquished territory, it's become a platform from which Israel is being attacked. At some stage, the penny has to drop. It was Einstein who said doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, is insanity. Mm-hmm. So basically, Israel's policy has been quite insane. Mm-hmm. And I do not believe that we will reach a consensual agreement with the Palestinians, mm-hmm. especially not in Gaza. I think there's no alternative but to go into Gaza mm-hmm. permanently, to keep Gaza. And if you don't want to rule over another people, you have to instigate a large initiative for incentivized immigration to third-party countries. Now, I know people raise an eyebrow when I say this, but if you look at what's going on in Gaza, there is a huge desire to leave Gaza mm-hmm. and find an alternative place mm-hmm. to live. We should be encouraging that. And that goes back to the point that I made earlier about Israel's public diplomacy. Israel should be explaining that the real humanitarian solution to Gaza is not to give humanitarian aid, because by giving humanitarian aid, basically you're sustaining your enemy. Mm-hmm. You should be giving humanitarian funding to help the Palestinians extricate themselves from the cycle of violence and find a better, more secure life in third-party countries. And I say, well, who will accept them? If they come with enough money, why shouldn't they be accepted? And that's the point. We can go into that, and if we've got enough time to go into the whole question. Because
But,
if
wait,
we,
but as for the military actions that Israel does now, so do you think that the reactions are actually useless?
yes, you can see. I mean, basically, we're legitimizing arson and the burning of Israeli fields and the shelling of Israeli civilian centers by not responding forcefully enough, by tolerating it, by what they call in Hebrew lachil, to internalize. We're basically legitimizing attempts to kill Jews, and in the long run, I believe that there will either be Arabs in Gaza or Jews in the Negev, but there won't be both, because life will become unlivable for Jews in the Negev, and you can see the dissatisfaction and the disaffection of the Gaza envelope residents in the last engagement. People, why would you want to raise your children if your own government is not defending you? And it's only been a matter of luck that these incendiary balloons and explosive balloons haven't killed anyone. It's only a matter of luck that the Palestinians haven't killed more people with their rockets. But poor aim doesn't give you the moral high ground, and so I believe that, accompanied with a strategic diplomatic effort to explain, we've been trying to reach an agreement now on the basis of some Palestinian self-governance for 1/3 of a century. 1/3 of a century, since 1993. At some stage, you have to say, guys, it doesn't work. And what more do you need? I mean, if people say what I'm saying is impractical, I think what's proved impractical is the two-state solution, because that's been tried with massive political backing, massive financial aid. You talked about financial aid. Gaza at one stage was one of the highest per capita recipients of foreign aid. But they use it for cement, for tunnels, and unless you can take hold of the government, you've got no control over where that aid goes. So it's just throwing money at the problem. Is this going to make it worse? Because you'll give them more resources to attack you with. And if I just can say one thing about the 2 points we talked about before, about the strategic edge and Yoram's point about our defensive posture. Both of those are connected to Judea and Samaria. Because if you strip Israel of Judea and Samaria, you will undermine dramatically its deterrent posture and make Israel a much less desirable ally for the Sunni states that now seeking Israel's friendship. And you'll have to spend so much money to make up the strategic value of the high ground. You're going to erode Israel's military advantage anyway. So as I said before, for Israel, preventing the highlands of Judea and Samaria, also the West Bank as it's called, is probably one of the most vital strategic interests of the country.
Ambassador Ettinger, your take on the Gazan situation, short term and long term?
Well, it seems to me that the leaders of Gaza, just like the leaders in Iran, just like the leaders of Hezbollah or the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, are not driven by standard of living. They are not driven by trade balance. They are driven by an ideology which sees no room at all for what they call an infidel Jewish state in what they call the abode of Islam. The issue is not the size of the Jewish state, the issue is the existence of the Jewish state. And therefore any attempt by Israel to perform gestures, to negotiate, to manage, and to propose some retreats by Israel only whets the appetite of those terrorists. Israel, in my mind, would be well advised to follow responsible medical procedure. A responsible doctor detecting cancer at the incept does not tell the patient, let's wait until the cancer spreads and grows. You uproot the cancer at the incept, or else you risk being extinct by that cancer. And the same thing applies to Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in the north. And I know it's very difficult and it would be very costly to deal simultaneously with both fronts. but it will be much more difficult and much more costly to deal with them when they become more powerful, which is exactly what we have done since 1993 and certainly since 2005, when we disconnected ourselves from Gaza. And therefore the bottom line is we should prefer preemptive offensive rather than reactive offensive against Hamas in Gaza.
Right. Well, gentlemen, I haven't called you here tonight in order to discuss politics, but since just a few miles from here in the Knesset, votes are taking place with regards to an extension of the time frame for budget, and the mistrust between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Defense Minister Gantz. So the next question, you can bite or pass as you like, but I'm really interested to know, what do you think may bring stability to the Israeli political system, and will we see it anytime soon? I'll start from the end. Professor Kedar.
Well, I think that all the politicians, both on the Likud and blue and white, feel that if they go now to elections, both will fail. Everyone because of various reasons, but both parties will lose much of their support. And this is actually what pushes them together to find some solution which will leave them with a coalition which functions in a way or another. And this is actually what pushes them, and this is why I believe that they will find a solution for the budget problem in order not to go to elections again, the fourth time within a year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Ettinger, bite or pass?
Well, it seems to me that what we experience now is a reflection of a dysfunctional political system. And dysfunctional political system yields very, very somber reality and result. The only way to rid ourselves from the current malaise of the political system is to uproot the current system and create a brand new system. It's very sad, for instance, that in the US there is a federalist system. It's not perfect, but it's definitely better than the one we enjoy. It's better in my mind than any European system, and it's based largely on Mosaic roots. It's based largely on the legacy of Moses and Aaron and the president of the tribe. If you read the founding fathers of the US, they based the system on what they perceive to be the perfect system of the Israelites on the way from Egypt to Canaan. And sadly, our founding fathers back in 1948-49 disregarded our own tradition, our own roots, and took some dysfunctional European systems, combined in it what we see today, Israeli system. Maybe it's time to turn back to our own roots, to our own history and our own legacy, and follow in the footsteps of what the American founding fathers taught us.
Well, it's a very interesting point of view. Thank you. Dr. Sherman?
Well, I don't think, if you look at politics as a game, I don't think it's the quality of the players. I don't think it's the rules of the game, as Yoram says. I think it's the topography of the playing field. I think that the structures, the socio-political structures here, cause the instability for two reasons. One, the great divide in Israeli politics is the Palestinian issue. Even if you look now, even though the left has virtually no electoral constituency whatsoever, the great divide is still between the people who see a Palestinian state enthusiastically and those who either oppose it or view it with great reluctance. As you can see now, recently there was an attempt to set up a government to include the Arab list. Now, the Arab list should be disqualified by law. I cannot understand why they're allowed to run, because the law says quite clearly that if you oppose Israel as a Jewish state and a democratic state, you can't run, and they oppose it. So I cannot understand how they can run. I mean, basically, the High Court is ignoring Israeli law. The other thing is that much of the influence on political systems here don't come from the elected politicians. They come from civil society elites. You know, I once composed what I said was the limousine theory of Israeli politics. Why a limousine? Because in a limousine you have a driver with a smart hat and an official uniform, and he holds the steering wheel, and sometimes he turns it left, and sometimes he turns it right, and sometimes he accelerates, and sometimes he changes lanes. But he doesn't determine the destination. The destination is determined by the people sitting in the back seats. Mm-hmm. And those are civil society elites, the legal system, the media, and academia, mainly social sciences and humanities. Now, the trouble is with the Israeli right is that they keep bringing a knife to a gunfight. If you look at it, when they write the history of Israeli politics, they will never understand how the left sustained itself as a political force, because it's been proved disastrously wrong for 3 decades. When basically the watershed was the Oslo agreements, and when the Oslo agreements came about, there were opponents and proponents. The proponents promised grand returns, new Middle East, peace and prosperity, and the opponents warned of dangers. Now, 3 decades later, 1/3 of a century later, the jury is no longer out. We know that none of the benefits materialized, and all the dangers, in fact, did. So I cannot understand how the Israeli right hasn't managed to banish the left wing to the outer darkness of public life here. And I think one of the reasons that it's still so unstable is that, as I said, the right keep bringing knives to a gunfight. They don't know how to conduct political warfare, because basically the left wing should have been sent to, ashamed to all the damage, all the death, all the injuries that it's caused with its insane policy. Mm-hmm. So I think, and the solution for that is to find a much more resolute, robust leadership for the right wing that can cast the left wing aside. You know, you look at what's happening now. People say Oslo is dead, but Oslo is not dead. Just the name is dead. The same thing about trying to strive for a Palestinian state. That was Oslo. Mm-hmm. And I remind people that up until the early 1990s, it was treason. People would go to jail for doing what the Likud is doing today. People went to jail for having for contacting the Palestinian terrorist group. And today, that's your entry ticket into polite society. It's crazy. I think in many ways we just lost our way, and we need to come to our senses.
General Hirsch.
Well, first I'd like to thank my friends here in this forum. I've been educated tonight, and great ideas, and thanks very much for everything you just said. I'd like to express my feelings speaking about our biblical roots, and I just mentioned the importance of our biblical roots, and the reason that we started the Newsrael First Forum here, just above the Temple Mount, Mount Scopus, near the Olive Mount, in the eternal capital of Israel, the city of Jerusalem. But the biblical roots that are well known worldwide is very much known because of the prophets' visions. The safe Israel people. And yes, I agree that it is very important that the wolf and the lamb will live together. But that may happen only if the lamb is changing and I prefer to be the roof. And it is very important that we will know how to understand the Bible and the prophecy. We need to be strong in order to stay here in the Middle East. We need to be very, very strong in order to preserve the front guard of the free world from here, to be lighthouse to the rest of the world with our morals and values and with our strength against evil forces, against terrorism, against fundamentalism, against jihadism. Now, in order to do all that, we need just to make sure that we will always remember what have we got in return for all the withdrawal we've made along the years. What have we got in return? Somehow we listen to many people from all around the globe that try to educate us, criticize us, telling us that we are too much offensive, aggressive, and paranoid. Now, we are not paranoid. There is really someone there, not only one, that is running after us and threatening us and wants us dead and not here. It is very important to be strong. And in order to create stability in our political system, I will pray that one day we will change our system. But one of the things that I see along the last few decades, that the people of Israel, which are clever, understood what have we got in return for all the withdrawal policy we've made. And they are moving to the right. And along the years and the next few decades, there will be stability in Israel because we will have the majority in the right side of the political map. So if we won't change the system, the right side of the political map, which is the majority of the Israelis today, will have enough power to create stability in our political system. And last point, I know personally General Benny Gantz and our Prime Minister Netanyahu. I know them personally, and I can tell for sure they are both Israeli patriots. They are dreaming always on a strong Israel, both of them. And I believe they will find the courage and the way not to take the people of Israel to another elections and another elections and another elections, but to let the people of Israel enjoy stability, especially in this period of time when COVID-19 appeared in our life as a black swan event, an unbelievable surprise when usually you do not have the right toolkit to cope with. And in this time of mega crisis, when all the world and us are confronting coronavirus, the right thing is to keep the coalition that was formed and to do everything is possible for the next few years to preserve the coalition in Israel and to bring comfort to the people of Israel.
Well, our time is up. So thank you, gentlemen, first of all, for joining us. Thank you for watching us from here, from Jerusalem. I wish you all the best and see you on our next Newsrael Forum. Good night.